Hello, everybody. I'm Everton de Oliveira from the Groundwater Project. And we also have another great book that I'd like to bring to you. We have done such a great job, and some of the books that we present to you are especially fine. Some of them makes me really jealous that I didn't have that opportunity to use it when I was a professor. Come on, you guys that are teaching and learning now have so many good products that you can use and you can learn and you can test your knowledge. I'm learning from the books, and that particular one was very good for me. I love that. So I bring to you today here Laura Toran. Laura is Wick's Chair in Environmental Geology in the Earth and Environmental Science Department at the Temple University in Philadelphia. Well, you may read her whole CV at the book, but that's not the most interesting part. The interesting part is the book itself. It's very, very well prepared. She brought to us a nice job. So, welcome, Laura. The first question for you is easy. Why care so much about groundwater contour maps? This is for the person your book is addressed. Why you came up with this idea?
Well, you sort of explained it in your introduction. As a teacher, I found there weren't enough exercises using head in the books that I was using over the years. And I think this skill is one that students end up needing when they get on the job, because maps, and in plan view maps in particular, are a key element of environmental reports. So I
Yes.
started creating exercises for my students, and this book is the compilation of those exercises.
That's very nice. I personally, I had a lot of trouble creating that. I'm not very creative on using those things. You've done a fine job on that. So how
I
was the book
looked at a lot of
organized?
maps.
I know. And so how was your book organized so the beginner, could best profit from the pace of the book?
Yeah, so one reason that head maps show up in so many environmental reports is that people are trying to track contaminant plumes. I wanted my book to end up there, but with a really firm foundation before we tackle something complicated like plumes, which have consequences for decision makers. So first you need to understand head, and you need to understand it in 3 dimensions, even though our brains are kind of wired to think in 2 dimensions at a time. So you need to know how head maps are constructed. You need to understand possible sources of error, and you need to understand their uncertainty. And all these topics, from what head is to how we construct things, is covered in chapter 2. Another important concept is underscored in the 3rd chapter, is that there's a specific pattern to how groundwater flows. And the saying I like to tell my students is, what goes down must come up. It's kind of reverse of gravity. But groundwater gets recharged, and then it moves along, and then it gets discharged. And so if you have a map that doesn't tell that story, that the water's coming in someplace, moving along, and going out someplace, you might need to go back and figure out what's wrong with your map or what's missing. Then finally, in chapter 4, we start looking at plumes and finish with a real world example that puts all these things together. You notice I didn't mention in the 1st chapter, what I did in the introduction was point out all the other groundwater project books that help you understand some of these basic principles, and where you can look for more information on topics that I mentioned more briefly in my book. I didn't want so much text that students would get bogged down and wouldn't try out the exercises, because I think those exercises are really important to help them build up their skills. So that was kind of my philosophy and how I could put the book together.
No, I like that. And as you explain it, that's how I see the book because I read it and I love it. It is very good. The exercise, you're building information from one to the other and you learn as you go through. That's quite nice. Very good. So I have a question for you. May I screw up my interpretation by choosing the wrong type of monitoring well? Because this is important. It's right at the beginning of your book. And why can I make such a mistake by choosing a wrong monitoring well?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question, and we don't ask how our interpretations are affected by measurements enough. So you're basically saying, how does my
True.
measurement affect what I see? So in the case of wells, the well can give you a lot of information about your geologic setting. It can tell you what formations you've encountered and where you can expect aquifers and aquithards. But knowing your setting can also help you to figure out where to drill. So you need to figure out how deep to drill, how many wells, and what your open interval should be. So there's a place where I gave some examples of how you might mess up. If you have a really wide open interval, that is a hole that's open to a lot of the geology. It gives you information about the geology, and we also use big open intervals if we're concerned with water supply. If you have a narrower open interval, it's better for monitoring because you're sampling at one point. And where the heads are varying vertically, you need to monitor at a specific depth. In addition, for sampling, a wide open interval is going to perhaps dilute your chemistry, whereas a narrow one will give you an isolated sample. So you need to know which you have. When we look at a 2D map, we see dots on that map, and it just says there's a well there. It's up to you as the user of this map to figure out what your open interval is. And sometimes you need to mix data from both sources. You got to use that in your interpretation and include it in maybe some of your uncertainty. So these are some of the ways that I think how the well is constructed and how it's placed can affect our interpretations.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. It is sometimes people just, they look over that information, and it's so important for us to understand, especially as you mentioned, if we have, and when you're a bit more trained and you close to some, or you have a feeling that you might have vertical flow, right? Then you have to be really concerned of the kind of well that you're using, right?
Yeah.
That could
And,
be,
and like I said, when you're looking at a map, the well is a dot on a
it's a
map,
dot,
but that
exactly.
dot means a lot. There's a lot of information there.
Exactly, exactly. So for a trained eye, contour maps tell us a lot, like you mentioned, tell us a lot about the groundwater flow. Really, how you believe that someone will develop this eye from working through your book, through the exercises?
So a lot of the exercises in my book are based on real world maps from the US Geological Survey. And I got a big thank you to the USGS for publishing so much information on groundwater. But because these are real world maps, you can gain a lot of practical understanding. You see what people put on maps, you see things that really happen in things that you might really encounter. Then the questions I ask are intended to guide you to think about those maps and interpret them. Look for those places where recharge is occurring, and look for where it's discharging. Look for the story that those maps tell you. One of the things that I really hope is that students will try the exercises before jumping to the back of the book to read the answers. Because I think it's really important that you make a few mistakes and learn from them rather than just reading. Don't just do things with your eyes. Get that aha moment when you go, oh, now I get it. You're often asked to do things on the job that you have to teach yourself. And I think these exercises can be good practice for that, with the safety net of being able to check your answer, because all the answers are also provided.
Yeah, no, I really agree with you. As you see, I of course I wasn't practicing on all the exercises. I just read them through, but I've been working with that for so long. Maybe I can, you can
You can
excuse me
skim
for
a
that.
little
You
bit,
can
but I'm
excuse me
hoping
for
that
that.
students will, yeah, take the time to look at the maps. They're very rich in information. And I
They
thought a
are.
lot about the
They are.
questions that I
Yeah,
asked.
I can tell you because I know that you put a lot of time choosing the good ones because they're very important. So one aspect, let's look for another way, and that's something that happens for people when they are learning the hydrogeology, or they're young. You go to a field, then you have to place your wells, right? So uh, after people are, they go through your exercise, how do you think they're going to develop their confidence on where to place your wells when coming to a new site? And how is this so?
Yeah, so again, I think because they're real world maps and you see what other people have done, it sort of gives you a chance to see where you got information and where you might have a few gaps, where you might be a little bit puzzled about what's going on. And so one of the things I tell my students is we never have as much information as we want in groundwater. It's hidden
Perfect.
underneath the ground. We never have enough wells. And so learning to interpolate between the places where we have information and learning when we just really need a little bit more, I think you get that by looking at practical examples. Um, so that's kind of my guidance. I don't think in words I really talk about how to place wells, but the hints of it are all throughout because of the use of maps and maps that were developed with real wells.
It's true. That's true. I had that question for you because when I was teaching, and especially when I was teaching people, I have a company as well, and I have to help people do field work. And I always go there and try to help them have the conceptual model in their minds before drawing the wells, right? Of course, the first one without any wells, we're bound to make a lot of mistakes, right? Because you're just guessing, right? But at least we, after we have the information that you provided on your book. We can anticipate, for example, well, I'm closer to a creek here. Well, that might likely be a discharge area, right? So I might be seeing vertical flow, or I'm close to a water divide. I'm on a higher position, so same way, and so on, right? Or we can get some feelings from the geology if we have enough
Yes.
information.
Yeah,
And
and I
that,
think one of the things that I tell my students is that you can tell the difference between somebody who's had some training and someone who hasn't in a couple of ways. One is their ability to think in three dimensions.
yeah,
And we have to train ourselves to do that. It's not
certainly,
totally intuitive.
yeah.
So I hope I provided enough examples where you had to think vertically and horizontally and then vertically and kind of flip your mind back and forth. The other thing is to have a picture in your head, like you said, a conceptual model before you go out and constantly be testing that. It requires a bit of geologic knowledge. I think that's why groundwater so often is taught in geoscience departments is
Yes.
you need that a little bit of background information of that intuition of what could happen that geology provides.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Let me dig a little bit deeper into the plume. We haven't talked because I know that we haven't talked a lot about the plumes, but if we do know the flow, right? Or if we have enough information to have you know, uh, a well understanding of the flow, plumes are much easier, right?
Yeah, what I tell my students, because sometimes they want to jump in and do something with contaminants and plumes right away. And I try to point out, if you don't know what groundwater is doing, you don't know what that plume is doing. And there's
Yep.
so much that we need to learn about groundwater before we can understand plumes. But that part is fundamental. If you get that wrong, the rest of your understanding of the plume is going to be wrong. And that's how things end up getting contaminated because something happens that we didn't predict because we didn't understand groundwater flow.
True, true. That's exactly the point. People they so concerned about concentrations and trying to put concentrations in the map. And if the flow is wrong, they'll never fix the problem, right?
Yeah, and so often flow is tied to things like hydraulic conductivity, and you're going to
Yeah,
need to understand that to understand your plume, um, because then that forces you to think about aquifers and aquatards and then porosity and other characteristics of the aquifer and aquitard that can help you understand what might happen to the plume in terms of these more complicated things like dispersion, which is not the main topic of my book. But if you don't know groundwater flow first, you're not going to understand dispersion.
No, definitely not. I can tell you, I have some good examples because you get so, let's say, uh, I don't know, accustomed to the idea of developing this groundwater flow model into your mind. So when you arrive on a new location, you're already looking for hints or and how the groundwater is moving or behaving in this place. So it's typical for us professionals in the area. But the fun thing is that sometimes we are completely wrong, right? This is the
Yes.
interesting thing because you expect
Especially
a
if
lot.
you don't do, yeah, I think especially if you don't do any field work.
Exactly.
If you're doing it all from your desk, you can
Exactly.
get,
No, but not only. I have two examples that I always I was really surprised. Once I went to a place in Bolivia in the Andes there. It's a city around a very nice lake, right?
mm,
Well, lake for us, we always thinking about the contour maps and the flow lines. And it was just a lake that had no connection with groundwater. Because just clay on the bottom of it is just
yes.
and then you go
Oh,
there and you look for a well and you don't get the water because it's about 100 meters deep, right? It is, that's groundwater. There's no
I
relation
love
with
it.
this thing.
I give my students an exercise like that, and it's contoured, and the contours don't point toward the lake. And I put in big letters, draw flow lines, but don't draw them quickly. Look at your contours. And they almost always draw the flow lines toward the lake because
Exactly.
they've been trained. But you really do need to look. I didn't include that exercise. It just didn't make it into the book, but
Yeah, no, but
it was
yes.
on my list.
Yeah, no, yeah, and another time so we had a lot of wells on a hill like this, and the hill was quite steep.
Hmm.
And there was a big it was a river down there, but not too far, maybe less than 100 meters. It was very close.
Hmm.
And we put a well close to the river just to check we check the relationship
Yeah.
with the and no water in the, in the well.
Oh,
Oh,
yeah, yeah. That's a little more unusual.
that's very unusual. That's very unusual because you expect the river, especially in a humid area, we expecting it to be gaining water from the aquifer. That's what we expected, and it wasn't
Right,
happening like that. So
right.
there's no way we can guess everything, right? So never be
You
so
can't.
sure. Never.
And I think one of the things that I like about looking at real maps is that you see the possibilities.
Yeah.
You can learn, it's a way of kind of learning without having to do everything in the field. Somebody's already done it and they're showing you. So you can
Yes.
show them things like this on a map and hopefully kind of this people looking at the maps are picturing themselves out in the field.
That's true. That's true. But it's a good thing. And in the end, I really enjoyed your book. It's so nice,
Oh, thank
and
you.
I'm pretty sure it's going to be very useful for people. That's one of the things
I,
I like about the groundwater project, and it allows us to have books like yours. Because otherwise, you wouldn't be able to put together all this nice information that you selected in it's hard to publish, and now we have this possibility. So congratulations for a very nice job. And please make your final
oh,
considerations.
well, I think what we've been talking about is that instructors will find helpful exercises for their students and things that they can use in their classes. And that's what I really hope for in this book. I think a good question can intrigue students and that by using maps from real places and asking questions that they would encounter out on the job, I'm hoping they'll make groundwater more interesting to students. I also want to point out that I really admired the groundwater project book, Conceptual and Visual Understanding of Hydraulic Head by Cohen and Cherry. And they had they gave a really nice three-dimensional description of groundwater flow. And I wanted to complement that book with more map view 2D maps. So what I'm hoping is that students will read these two books together. And then, as I mentioned, I provide a lot of other references to groundwater books for interested readers. So I think this is something where I think this book can be an entry to get people curious to read some of the other books.
They certainly will. But above all, what I do expect from them working with your book is that they're going to be good on head maps, which is so important for hydrogeologists. So congratulations and thank you for such a nice job. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.